Well said.
All right. Well, is everybody doing all right? Everybody doing good? This is a reminder. We are in this series called Cover to Cover, where we are making our way through. It's very ambitious, actually, making our way through the entire Bible over this next year. And what do you guys think? Like, going all right so far? Everybody like pretty good picture of the Bible so far? This week we're beginning the book of Numbers. We have a Bible reading plan. I hope you guys are engaged in that. A lot of stuff going on, and we're gonna get right into our number stuff here in just a minute. But before we do that, I want to see if you guys can finish this sentence for me. I think I actually have it up here. It's not about the destination, but about the journey, right? Is that true? I remember my dad used to say that we would be like on a road trip somewhere. And like, Dad, are we there yet? He's like, well, don't worry about it. It's not, not about the destination. It's about the journey. Anybody else's parents ever say that to him? And it's like, dude, that's terrible. I hated that as a kid, And then it's like, but now that I'm an adult, my kids do it. And I say the same exact thing. I'm like, oh, just look out the window, enjoy the journey, And I'm like, dude, I know that's a load of baloney, but it is what it is. And so, it's like that works if the journey is good. But what if the journey is terrible? Is it about the journey at that point? Well, I don't know. We'll actually maybe answer that question okay by the end of the day. Anybody have, like, show of hands, a terrible road trip story? Anybody have one? There you got a few people. So I want to share a terrible road trip story with you guys. I have like numerous to pick from, but I chose this one. Some of you guys have heard parts of this. We're moving. It's going on about 6 years ago now. We were moving from Florida up to Washington, 3,300 miles. Man, that's a haul. And we got family in Arkansas, so we drove up there. We spent a couple weeks in Arkansas. We're going to spend some time hanging out there, seeing family. And we had packed all of our stuff in these big giant blue totes because there are military horror stories, am I right? If you've had the military movie stuff and there's like, you show up and it's like all your clothes have been eaten by moths somehow over the last month. It's been in storage or something crazy like that. All kinds of these crazy stories. And so we packed every shred of clothing that we owned because we lived in Florida for 6 years, man. We were not equipped to come to Washington, just FYI. And so we stopped in Arkansas, and the next day, we had finished our time there in Arkansas. The next day, we were going to go to Branson, Missouri. Anybody been there? Redneck Riviera, baby. Woo-wee! Ride them roller coasters at Silver Dollar City, man. So that's what we were getting ready to do the very next day. And then we were, late that night, we were packing up all of our stuff, washed all of our clothes, and we're kind of getting everything arranged because this was really going to kick off the road trip like across the state, right? Or across the states. And Danielle is like the most awesome travel agent in the world. She picks all the coolest sites and the best places to stay and all that. So it was like, we were really excited about this. So we were there, we were packing everything up in the suitcases or in these big giant blue totes. And some of you guys know, do you know what a brown recluse spider is? You guys? Okay, so from the South, that's like the most terrifying thing to see in your closet and then not see in your closet, right? You know what I'm saying? And so we're sitting there, and we've been all in these tubs. In like late spring, early summer is like the peak brown recluse season. For some reason, they just like invade your houses. And if they bite you, man, they will mess you up. They will rot your arm off, man. I know some people that's like missing chunks of their body because they got bit. You guys that have lived here in Washington your whole life don't know how lucky you have it. And they're super aggressive. Like they get into clothing and stuff, and you put your clothes on, and it's like, dude, they'll get you, man. They'll get you. So we were there, and we had these totes open for like 2 weeks in Arkansas. And we're sitting there talking. We just finished arranging everything, and I see like crawl up on top of a pile of clothes and then down into the clothes. And we're like, oh, heck no. And so within 2 minutes, we're gloved up like we're disarming a biological warhead, man. I got like rubber gloves and like tongs and stuff, and we're like shaking all the clothes. Just so you know, we weren't like we found three of them in our luggage, man. That would have been a bad day for anybody, right? And so we were justified in kind of freaking out a little bit. So we're like shaking all our clothes out. And I'm trying to shake a brown recluse spider off of this piece of clothing, and I hear the pitter-patter of feet come down the stairs at my parents' house. And it's Jack. And Jack's like, I don't feel good. And so I'm like, take a glove off, and I got like a hand on his forehead. Yep, he is burning up hot, right? So this happens, and I literally still have my hand on his forehead, and I hear the pitter-patter of other feet come down the stairs, and it's Charlotte, and she turns sideways, and she has, it's gross, she has throw up all in her hair, and she's like, I don't feel good either. Blah, and she throws up everywhere. This is how we began leg one of our journey across the United States, y'all. And it went only downhill from there, right? Like we finally get to Silver Dollar City, and we're like riding the roller coasters, and I start to feel this tickle in the back of my throat, y'all. And within an hour, I've got like 102 fever that I kept. Y'all, I cooked away an entire semester of college. My brain fried itself for like 2 weeks. We couldn't figure out what it was, but it felt like we thought it was strep because I was like swallowing shards of glass. It was the worst thing ever. I don't even remember South Dakota. Y'all, I just fought the death angel for the entire trip across. Danielle drove, and she's like, dude, South Dakota was beautiful. I'm like, I have no recollection of this place, right? I was dead in the back of the car, right? We witnessed a gruesome, terrible tragedy in view of the whole family. Like, it was bad. Anybody else have, like, you've been there? You've been on this place, right? Well, why in the world do I tell you this story, okay? Because when a road trip is awesome, there's nothing quite like it, right? The sounds, like the sights, the food. I love the food, right? The open road, the freedom of like, man, I have no responsibilities but to just get up and see more of this awesome country tomorrow, right? And we're just taking off and going to go to, I'll never forget this. Anybody been to Mount Rushmore? So I was in the military at that time, and if you're there when they close things out, it's like they make a big deal about it. And my whole family is like, they call all the military people up to the stage, and they do this big like hoopla for that. And that's awesome and all that, but I'm dying in the stands. Like, I am dying. And Danielle, bless her heart, never believes me when I say I'm sick. And she's like, oh, get up there on stage, And they're like, my mother-in-law and father-in-law, they're like pushing me up on the stage, and I go up there, and I'm like standing at attention, like shivering to death. Like, it's cold, and I have a fever, and I'm just like trying not to puke on the stage where I'm standing like in front of 5,000 people. I don't know. It was probably 1,000 though. A bunch of people there. And it was like, it was miserable, right? Because when a road trip goes bad, there's also nothing quite like that either, right? Like, dude, I don't care. Like, I've had bad days, but bad days on vacation or bad days on a road trip, bro, you remember those things. Like, over time, you definitely remember those things, right? And you learn these lessons from those moments in time. Like, hey, don't leave your luggage unzipped in the South in the middle of brown recluse season, right? Or don't take a handful of laxatives in the middle of the South Dakota desert. Part of the story you guys didn't hear, right? But like it, I'm telling you, it was bad, right? And so here's the deal. I really, really like the road trip metaphor and this idea that life is like this sort of journey. Life is a journey. And we've said that, right? That here at the Outpost, man, we really want to help engage with people as they take whatever their next step of faith and faithfulness is. Because that's how it works. It's one step after the next. And I really, really like that sort of metaphor for life as a journey or this road trip. Because you see, our character, our minds, our bodies, our souls even, are shaped by the accumulation of experiences over time. You guys tracking? You guys know what I mean by that, right? Like, we are shaped by these experiences, this accumulation of things that we either like endure or survive sometimes, right? But this accumulation of things that happens over time, and that somehow shapes us. We really like the diet pill mentality, though. You guys know what I mean by that? It's like, hey, take one pill, and then you'll, whatever, all your fitness dreams will be realized. Anybody like fallen for that ever? Or like, and they repackage it some different way every few months, right? But the reality is like that doesn't work. Like 95%, like the 5% of those sort of diet fads that actually are evaluated by the FDA, what they find out is like they're not actually effective at doing what they say they're going to do. They just won't kill you if you put them into your body, right? When they say, so this has been FDA approved, it's like that doesn't mean it's effective. In fact, we don't have anything because it doesn't work like that, does it? Dude, diet and exercise, a healthy life is like, dude, it is faithfulness to like healthy eating, healthy patterns of exercise, and rest over a long period of time. That's what makes like real change in that. You guys tracking what I'm saying? And we know this. Right, we know this truth, but I just wanted to remind us of it because the book of Numbers is like the worst road trip in the history of all road trips, right? That's where we're going, right? And I don't want to be like insensitive about this next statement, but the best terrible road trips are other people's terrible road trips, right? You guys try what I'm saying? Like, here's the deal. If you travel in the South at peak prime recluse season, leave your luggage zipped. Don't take the handful of laxatives in the middle of South Dakota desert, right? Don't do that. Or like if you're going to visit the urgent care at a national park, check and make sure they take your insurance. Hey, FYI, military folks, they don't. We went to 3 of them at that period. 2, didn't know this, but Yellowstone has 2, actually. And so lessons learned in this, and here's the deal. It's like I can tell that story and we can laugh about it and all that stuff, and it's like you get to learn the lesson without actually having to be there. Because here's the deal. I've always said there's 2 types of people, and I definitely want a show of hands on this, right? They're the people that have to touch the stove to figure out it's hot. Anybody? Who is it? Jake, thanks for being honest, buddy. Leading the track off, right? It's like the stove is hot, and it's like there's some people in here that's like, yeah, I still have the burn marks from the stove. Actually, it happened at our house just the other day. Charlotte was testing how close she could get her hand to the stove, right? And she's not my one that I thought was the touch the stove kind of gal. But turns out we heard this blood-curdling scream. She's okay, no severe burns or anything. But like it is hot. And she touched her hand to it. And then there's this other crowd, and you guys raise your hand, that's like, actually, just watching somebody else touch the stove is good enough, and I don't have to touch. Okay, amen. Good for you guys, man. Good. I will not tell you which one of those 2 people that I am, right? But here's the deal. God is using the lessons learned from an entire generation in the worst road trip in history ever, right, to teach all of us some very, very important lessons. That's what the book of Numbers is doing. Lessons like, how do we follow God when the future seems uncertain? Right? Whose wisdom do we trust when conventional wisdom fails us? Right? Like there's some things that add up in this equation, and then there's some things that don't. And if I'm going to base my decision off of conventional wisdom, it's like, dude, I have no way to, I don't know what to do next. So what do we do in those moments when conventional wisdom, who do we trust? What does it look like to live a life completely in step and with following after God? That's one of those religious platitudes. It's like, oh yes, I follow God. What does that even mean in like the day-to-day like things of life? How do you live in step with a God that you can't see like physically walking? Like what does that look like, right? Here's maybe my favorite one that Numbers begins to address. Is like, if we don't lean far enough forward or walk far enough out on this branch that it's going to snap, right? If God doesn't show up to like keep the branch from snapping, have we really walked out in faith at that point? Like if you can't lean so far forward that you're going to fail if God doesn't show up, then is that really living in faith and trusting after what God is doing, right? And there are these moments that we see the Israelites, and they have a chance to like lean forward beyond like their center of gravity, that if God doesn't show up to push them back, they're going to fail. And what do you do in that moment? And what does that show you about who you are and who you really trust in those moments, right? Anybody ever been there in like real life? It's like, dude, we can take this step, but if God doesn't show up in this, bro, we're ruined. We're broke. We're whatever, right? Like, dude, this is like, do we trust Him? And dude, is that what living in faith looks like? And man, I think these are just a few of the lessons that the book of Numbers is trying to communicate. And here's the choice. You can either choose to make the same mistakes as those in the book of Numbers and experience the same judgment and consequences, or you can learn from those. Right? You can be one of those 2 types of people. You can touch the stove for yourself. You can see that they touched it and it's hot, and be like, nah, I'm going to touch it too and see if it's hot, right? And here's the deal. I think that these are just a few of the very like majorly applicable life questions that the book of Numbers addresses. But in order to see them, we really got to dive into the story. You guys good with that, right? And if we're going to dive into the story, we're going to start this week with our story, with our study concepts. We'll get there here in just a second, right? But before we do that, we have to remember something that I taught you guys a few weeks back, and is that, man, we have to understand this story in the way that original audience understood this story. You guys tracking what I'm saying? So here's the deal. The book of Numbers was written to the Joshua generation. Joshua's generation, if you're taking notes, to teach them how to trust in God and follow his leadership. Now, we're going to meet the Joshua generation at the end of the Numbers story today, but really, like moving forward, that's who this is going to pick up with, right? We're going to watch an entire generation of people die, and this next generation that's going to actually be the generation to go in and possess the promised land under Joshua's leadership, we call them the Joshua generation. So the book of Numbers was written to that generation, and here's why. That generation was about to be put in a place where every single step that they took was going to be either life or death for them. They were untrained and largely unarmed group that would have been easy pickings for even the smallest nation, and yet God was bringing them into this land where like all the nations, all they loved to do was just fight one another. Like, y'all, they had a spring festival between a couple of the nations that they weren't even mad at each other. They just wanted to get together and kill each other, so they didn't forget how to kill each other well in battle. This was the nation that God was bringing the Israelites into. This is a former group of untrained, unarmed slaves into the land. In every step, if you don't follow me in every single step, man, it will spell disaster for you. Chapter 5 of the book, we meet, Joshua meets this guy, man, the captain of the Lord's army. You guys know that story? Some of you guys have been around a little bit. Joshua's taking a stroll. They're on the other side of the Jordan River. They're getting ready to walk into Jericho. It's kind of hurdle number one they got to get over. And they're drawing up battle plans, and they're figuring out what this thing's going to look like. And I got to imagine it was terrifying, man. Jericho had these incredibly thick, well-fortified, you couldn't lay siege to Jericho, right? Siege warfare didn't work for Jericho. And so, how are we going to do this? And so they're scrambling for this. And then Joshua's out for a walk, maybe to clear his head one night or something. And he runs into this guy, and he's got a sword drawn. I wish I had a sword, man. That'd be so cool. And he had it out, and he was pointing at his face, and he was and Joshua was like, whoa, hey, who are you? Are you with us? Or are you with them? Valid question on the eve of war, right? And the guy says, neither. I'm the commander of the Lord's army. Joshua falls down at his feet and says, what do we do? Right? We're not making a move unless you tell us where we go next. And where do you think Joshua learned that? I think he learned it right here. Numbers chapter 14, 27 through 34. As Moses had sent this group of spies into the land to check out the land 40 years prior, Joshua was just a young man at that time, and he was with this group of spies watching things sort of shake out. And here's how that story goes. They come back and they bring a report out of the land, and here's what it is. It says, how long shall I bear with this evil congregation who are grumbling against me? Well, they were grumbling against God because they went in and they did the math and they said, we're ruined. If we go into this land in the shape that we are, man, we're going to be we're going to be dead, and our wives and our kids are going to be slaves and plunder. This isn't going to work out, right? And so God's like, why are you grumbling against me? I've heard the complaints of the sons of Israel, which they are making against me. Say to them, as I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I will surely do to you. This is coming to pass. Your corpses will fall in the wilderness. Imagine Joshua standing there, hearing Moses say these words. Man, he'd just been in the land and he had advocated to trust God and his plan in this thing. He had advocated to follow after God into the land just how God had told them. We'll be all right, guys, him and Caleb. And he's listening to this. Your corpses are going to fall. Except for Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. Your children, however, the ones that you worried were going to be captives and slaves, right? I will bring them in, and they will know the land which you have rejected. But as for you, your corpses will fall in the wilderness. Your sons shall be shepherds for 40 years in the wilderness, and they will suffer for your unfaithfulness until your corpses lie in the wilderness. Yeah, here's the deal, man. I think Joshua, as he is struggling for where do we go next, how is God going to lead us? And all of a sudden this guy shows up, battle armor ready on the eve of war, and he says, I'm the commander of the Lord's army. Man, I think Joshua was like, hey man, you say jump, I say how high, right? Where are we going and how do we? I'm not making a move without this. And I think the book of Numbers is written for us to take the same exact lesson from it. That we get an opportunity to watch an entire generation touch a stove as they fail to trust God, for his provision, for his safety, for his leadership, for all of these different things. Like they over and over and over again, man, they touch the stove, and they get burned. And we have the opportunity to watch the worst road trip in history and learn a few things. So you guys go with that. Y'all want to do that this morning, all right? Let's talk study concepts, and then we'll jump right into the story. Study concepts. I want to talk about genre this morning. You may know what a literary genre is. You want to throw one out there that you know? Fiction, yeah, would fall under the category of narrative, right? Anything else? Nonfiction, right? Yeah, also could be narrative. What? Anything else? Any other genres of literature you guys know? Poetry, yeah. So here's the question: do you read poetry the same way that you read narrative? Well, in the fact that you decode the English language as you read it, then yes, obviously you do. But actually, it requires a little bit more investment on your part, or a different type of investment. Like you read a water bill a little differently than you read a love letter or a message on Facebook or some other thing, right? Like that's like we know this, and we sort of get this concept that there are different types of literature and different ways that we read them. But man, we actually have to be very, very cautious in our approach and be very cognizant of this as we come into the Bible to read it the way like faithful to the type of literature that it is. You guys track what I'm saying, right? And here's the deal: the book of Numbers is primarily narrative. And to properly read a piece of narrative, the story arrangement is key. What's a story arrangement? You may know? It's how it's put together, how the plot moves forward through the story, right? It's arranged. Last week we looked at the book of Leviticus, right? I just sort of gave it to you last week. We're going to see how it works this week, right? Leviticus was arranged. Story arrangement was this outer section of matching themes, and then an intersection of matching themes, and then the center section of matching themes, and then it was all tied together by this thing in the middle, right? And so the arrangement of the book of Leviticus tells its own story along with the thing that it's trying to communicate just through its particular. You guys get what I'm saying, right? Like I know this is tough stuff, and it's the reason that we didn't pay attention in high school English and literature, right? But here's the deal: we got to do a little bit of work around this. Numbers isn't just narrative, though; it falls into the subcategory of historical narrative. So if you understand that, we typically view history from a secular or a human perspective. This is a big deal. We typically view history from a secular or human perspective, and yet Numbers is rooted in theological history as it views past events through God's perspective. Let me explain. Let's talk World War II for just a second. Modern historians do not invoke the mind of God to explain the origins of the Second World War. No, they look at the economic crisis of the 1920s, or to the psychological makeup of Hitler, or to the social climate following the First Great War. You guys kind of track what I'm saying. Those are the things that they sort of attribute to why the Second Great War happened. In discussing historical events, the Bible does not ignore human agency, but it is much more interested in the relationship of God to events, in how His purposes, often declared in advance through like prophets or dreams, things like that, right, were worked out in the life of Israel. Numbers is a prophetic or theological history in that it interprets Israel's founding events in terms of God's promises made to the patriarchs. You guys with me so far? Clear as mud? We doing good so far? All right, we looked at those promises of land, covenant, and seed. We looked at those weeks ago as we started out the book of Genesis. And so we have to see this story as kind of bringing to fruition some things that God had already promised to Abraham and the other forefathers, right? While poetry is primarily concerned with involving all of your personhood, your senses, your intellect, your emotions, right? It wants to drive a change in you as it sort of involves all these different parts of you. It makes you think. If you read poetry, man, you have to really stop. You really have to digest what's happening in those couple of lines of poetry, because it may say more between the lines or after the lines, or assume that more came before the lines than a page worth of narrative can do, right? It can just communicate more. And yet, narrative conveys its message through details and storyline. The problem is that details and storyline are at war with one another. And you guys felt it this week. And you didn't. If you're reading the book of Numbers, you felt this tension, and you may not have even really known that you were feeling this tension, right? Because details and storyline are at war with one another. Details want to draw you into the particulars of a story. Why is the donkey talking? You tracking that? You guys read that this week? Or actually, I think you'll read it this next week, unless you're ahead of, you'll read it this next week, right? But you're going to get there. So why is the donkey talking, right? What in the world is happening? So like, what we'll do is we'll stop and we'll like really zoom into that, and we'll try to really figure out what's going on. But really, man, the details are at war with this overlying like storyline that's actually happening. So we have to see both of these things happening at the same time. Details wants to draw you into the particulars of a story, while at the same time the story arrangement is conveying a truth on a much larger scale than any of the particular details can communicate. To properly read narrative, which is what this is, and like I really want to stop and do some work. I know this is a hard like school type stuff, but I want to do some work around this because you're going to get a lot of narrative. If you're like sticking with the Bible reading plan, you're about to go through like 3 months of nothing but narrative, right? And it's going to be historical narrative after historical narrative. We need to get this sort of concept as we move on, right? Because to properly read narrative, we must constantly be evaluating the details of each story within the context of the overall storyline to see how they support the larger image. We actually have no problem doing this at all. You guys read a novel or something like that, or you pick up a piece of fiction or whatever, and you're going along, you're cooking through the book just fine, and all of a sudden there comes this character that like hasn't been introduced yet, and he just starts talking like you're supposed to know who he is. You guys know what I'm saying, right? Like he just starts talking, and like you can assume like there's supposed to be some sort of backstory or something, or maybe he seems like he's going to be important to the story, and it's like, do we stop and just like let that freeze us up when we come to that in a story? No, we intuitively just zoom out and keep reading, because what do we trust? We trust that if it's good literature, it's going to clear up any mysteries or any unclear things, like as we see the story sort of like develop. For some reason, though, we read the Bible and we come to the talking donkey and we freeze and we stop. And we're like, wait a second. How did the donkey talk? Like, is that a miracle? Like, what was going on there? And then we try to ask these questions about it. Like, can more animals talk? And so I don't know. I don't know where your mind goes in that story, but we'll try to like fish some things out of that story. It's like, dude, if you get bogged down in the details, you're going to miss it. They're there, and they're there for a reason, and they're supporting this overall storyline, but you got to keep reading. All that to say, when you come to those moments, and you're going to come to them, you're going to come to a lot of them. Like, zoom out and keep reading. Don't forget the details. Keep them in your mind. And like 99 times out of 100, like as you look at the overall storyline, you're like, oh, that's what that was doing. That's why that was there. That's why the talking donkey was happening the way that it is, right? I'll leave that to you guys to figure out why the talking donkey this week, right? Clear as mud? You guys good? All right? Okay, so I think maybe the best way just for us to dive in, and you guys will see kind of what I'm talking about. Story overview. In English, we call the fourth book of the Torah, we call it Numbers. That's not its name in Hebrew. In Hebrew, the Hebrew Bible, the book of Numbers is called Bamidbar. Everybody say that? Bamidbar? Bamidbar, yeah. You guys learned some Hebrew, which means in the wilderness. And honestly, I think that's like a much more rad name than Numbers, right? Because we read Numbers and we think about these censuses that act as like bookends on the story. And I've had 3 different people over the last few weeks tell me that like, dude, I have actively avoided Numbers because its name is Numbers. Anybody just want to fess up? That's been me in the past. Anybody? Okay, a few people. Like, and here's the deal. If the first few chapters of this thing, it's like, and then this tribe came, and there were this many people, and it was this tribe, and right? And it's like, dude, like details. And they bog you down, like, what in the heck is this story doing? And then it ends with a bunch of numbers too. But really, if you miss it because it's called Numbers, you miss what is hands down one of the wildest roller coaster rides in the entire Bible, right? Because as you got into the book of Numbers, somebody that's like in the middle of the book of Numbers, is it boring? Like, no, dude, not at all. Numbers is a wild, wild ride, right? So don't miss it because it's named Numbers. The Numbers narrative is recounting Israel's journey from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land. That's what it's trying to do. And here's how the book is sort of arranged. If you read 10 different commentaries, they're all going to have 10 different arrangements. Nobody can really agree, but the best one that I found that's most agreeable to most people, and the one that I tend to go with as well, is this sort of movement around the geography, right? It's a road trip. And so chapters 1 through 10, they're encamped at Sinai, Mount Sinai. They've been there for about 2 years at this point. And they're making these final arrangements as the book of Numbers begins. They take a census, and they're about to march out of the camp there at Sinai. And then chapters 10 through 12 are this travel section. And it's chocked full of these different rebellions that they do. And there's some things that are happening in that. And we'll look at that this morning. And then chapters 13 through 19, they come to the wilderness of Paran, often called Kadesh in your Bible. And they spend a long time there. That's where they come and they send some spies out from the wilderness of Kadesh. And they give the bad report. And then all kinds of stuff happens as they wander around the wilderness. And here's the deal. If you've read like the entire book of Numbers, you're like one of those people that likes to get ahead, and you read the entire book, you don't really see that, do you? You don't really see like where did 40 years happen. There just comes a moment where it assumes in the story that 40 years has sort of happened, and it's somewhere near the end of that 13 through 19, the wilderness of Kadesh. Chapters 21 through 22, we get another travelogue as they leave the wilderness Kadesh, and they're headed to the plains of Moab, which is just on the other side of the Jordan River, like their staging area before they go into the land. And that's what chapters 22 through 36 is. They finally arrived at the plains of Moab, and they're like getting ready. And Moses stops there at the plains of Moab and is going to deliver this like final sort of farewell speech to the children of Israel. It's like, you guys are about to go in. Let me give you some instructions. If you're going to hang on to this beautiful land flowing with milk and honey that God has promised, let me give you a few final instructions. Here's the plains of Moab. This is where Balaam and Balak and the talking donkey, that's where all that stuff happens. It is there, right? Now, if you picture, okay, we already got it up there, perfect. If you picture that chart as like the vehicle which moves the storyline forward, then this is the wheels on the vehicle. It's this cycle of rebellion, judgment, and salvation. Familiarize yourself with this cycle, man, because you're going to see it over and over. Do we get to the book of Judges here in a few weeks? It's this cycle on steroids, like over and over and over again, right? Those 4 chapters of travel, that's what that's about. Like, and we see these cycles happen over and over and over. The book of Numbers should be seen through the recurring cycle of rebellion, judgment, and salvation. Now, here's the deal. You look on a map, and if you're seeing, like anybody's Bible has the maps on the back of it, that looks like a really long ways. But honestly, that journey should have taken them about 10 days, less than 2 weeks. They could have made it from Mount Sinai to the Promised Land in 10, I mean, that's with a lot of people moving through the wilderness. They could have made it in no time. Like, it wasn't a hard journey. If they would have stuck to some of the more populated areas, they shouldn't have lost a single person in that journey. And yet, it took them 40 years, and they lost an entire generation of people. And the question, why is that? It's rebellion, it's judgment, and salvation. Right? Let's look at an example from something that we've already seen this morning. It's Numbers 14, 2 through 4. He said, all the sons of Israel grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole congregation said to them, would that we had died in the land of Egypt. Circle, highlight, underline that in your Bible, because when you see that, y'all, the cycle is kicking off. Man, that's like the phrase that gets repeated to let us know that all right, so we're doing this again, right? We're back, we're touching the stove here, right? Would that we had died in the land of Egypt, or that we had died in this wilderness. Why is the Lord bringing us in this land to fall by the sword? Our wives and our little ones will become plunder. Would it not be better for us to return to Egypt? So they said to one another, let us appoint a leader and return to Egypt. Did you catch the rebellion in that? Like, God had told them that He would fight for them and successfully lead them into the promised land to possess houses they didn't build and drink wine from vineyards they didn't cultivate and eat food from gardens they didn't plant. Like, this is a good and spacious land that will support you if you just trust me. And they're like, no, it's not too late. We can go back. Maybe the Egyptians will forget that we killed Pharaoh and his entire army and ruined all their crops and destroyed their economy. Like, maybe they'll just forgive us for all that, and they'll take us back as slaves. And honestly, rebellion doesn't really even do it. Did you see what they were doing? It was a mutiny. Like, they were ready to elect a coward to lead them back to Egypt and just completely throw Moses and Aaron and all the leaders of Israel out, right? So, what does God do? This is 20 through 23. So the Lord said, I have pardoned them. Weird thing to do. I've pardoned them according to your word. Moses had interceded and just prayed that God wouldn't annihilate them. And God says, I will pardon them. But indeed, as I live, all the earth will be filled with the glory of the Lord. Surely all the men who have seen my glory and my signs which I performed in Egypt and in the wilderness, yet have put me to the test these 10 times and have not listened to my voice, shall by no means see the land which I swore to their fathers, nor shall any of those who spurned me see it. God is about to unfold an act that is both an act of judgment and an act of salvation, like simultaneously, in a way that only God can do. And here's what he says. Say to them, as I live, says the Lord, just as you have spoken in my hearing, so I'll surely do. Your corpses will fall in the wilderness, is what we read earlier. Even all your numbered men, according to your complete number, 20 years old and upward, who have grumbled against me, surely you shall not come into this land, right? Except for Joshua and Caleb. And then 31, your children. They get to come into, right? Your children, whom you said would become prey, I will bring them in, and they will know the land which I have rejected. God is carrying out an act of judgment against the Israelites because they failed to trust Him. They failed to follow Him into the land they promised. And don't miss this. God was judging them by honoring their decision. What did they ask for? We don't want to go in, right? Look, we don't want to go into the land. And God said, well, I'm just going to strike you all dead. No, He didn't say that, did He? No, actually, fine. You don't have to go in if you don't want to. You don't. I will give you exactly what you want. God is honoring their decision. This is a very practical point for us to take away from this. God will honor your decision to rebel against Him. He absolutely will. And this in itself is its own judgment because true life is only found in Him. You can waste your entire life in rebellion against God's law, and He will allow you the freedom of choice to do that. And honestly, that's terrifying. He forces no one to follow Him. And you may be thinking like you may look at this story and think kind of objectively at it, like, really? No choice? Like, it kind of seems like God had a gun to their head, right? Like, either you go into the land or I'm going to kill you in this wilderness, right? Anybody? That's like, no, it doesn't really look like they had much of a choice, but actually, man, it's for this very argument that I chose this example. The answer is no. God did not have a gun to their head. They were just under the same illusion that we often fall victim to, that we think that we can do better. We think that we can find life and satisfaction apart from God's design and law. We think we know better for our morals, our marriage, our finances, our future, our sexuality, our business ethics, our relationships, our fill in the blank. We think we know better in all of these areas. And here's the deal. God will totally honor your choice in every single one of those areas. The problem is that we think that we can find life and satisfaction. And yet the deep truth of this story is that if we believe that, we've believed a lie. There is no true life or satisfaction to be found in any of those areas as long as we are in rebellion to God. Don't read God's judgment and His anger against the Israelites as like some sort of rage or spiteful vengeance. I think we may be tempted to do that. Like maybe God was being a little petty about it. Like, okay, fine, if you don't want to do what I say, then you can just die in the wilderness, right? Like God's like, no, actually God was honoring the very thing that they wanted. All right, you don't want to potentially see like your wife and your children become slaves there in Egypt. I will honor that. You don't have to go in. The illusion was that there was still like something good to be had on the other side of that. That like somehow they could, like through their decision to not do that they would still, no, like you're still going to die. Like, and in fact, like you would have been free had you came in, but now you don't get the beauty of coming into this promised land. God is frustrated because He knows the amazing plans and wonderful blessing that awaits them if they follow Him, and yet they've chosen a slow death in the wilderness because they think they know better. And yet we still see God's mercy and grace extended to those who did choose to follow Him. Caleb, Joshua, right? There's actually an entire generation of people that are too young to make this decision for themselves. And so God says, man, you're going to get your chance. There's going to come a moment for you that you come to the same crossroads answering the question of, will you trust me and will you follow me as I have designed through my law and through my revelation? Like, will you do that? What do you think they did? Well, they failed some, right? We're going to see actually a few of those even today. They failed some. But actually, man, by and large, they learned their lesson. Watched an entire generation of their relatives, their friends, their neighbors drop dead in the wilderness as a result of their own choice. I don't know better. In that Joshua generation, with minor exceptions, hands down the most faithful generation that ever existed in Israel. Dude, they went on to do some amazing things because at just about every turn, and they trusted God in this. They weren't without fault, but they did a pretty good job. This is the same thing that we get to do as we read the book of Numbers. Or you can choose to define it for yourself and find out that the stove is hot. And God will honor your decision to do that, right? But there's more to the book of Numbers than just this one story. So let's go through this. We'll move through really quickly through the rest of our story overview, and we'll close out with one of these pictures of Christ from the book. All right, chapters 1 through 10. They detail the census of Israel, this assortment of laws for living in the promised land, and then their marching instructions. Now, you guys have seen that. Chapters 1 through 9, if you read, this is the hard part about the book of Numbers, right? It breaks this whole process down so tediously, so detail-heavy that you can miss what's happening in the storyline. Yes, getting that right? And so we'll read these things about like the tribe of Gershon and Merari and how they had to walk before the Kohathites. You guys read that and like, yep, skipping right over that stuff, right? And who cares that the tribe of Judah comes before the tribe of Reuben, or who cares like where at around the temple they are, or who's carrying the spoons and who's carrying the tent. You see all that stuff, right? And it's like so easy to get bogged down in those details, right? Like let's read chapter 10, verse 11 through 14. Now, the second year, the second month, the 20th of the month, this is as they are leaving Mount Sinai, this is what happens, right? The cloud that was God's presence was lifted from over the tabernacle of the testimony, and the sons of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sinai. Then the cloud settled down in the wilderness of Paran. That's where they're headed next, right? So the next two chapters after this are their travel log. So they moved out from the first time according to the commandments of the Lord through Moses. The standard of the camp of the sons of Judah, according to their army, set out first with Nahshon, the son of Amminadab, over his army. Then we get a list of all these other names, and then we read this, verse 17. Then the tabernacle was taken down. So it was taken down. The sons of Gershon and the sons of Merari, who were carrying the tabernacle, they set out. Then some more names, some more people set out, and they start following on. And then verse 33 through 36, other stuff you probably skipped over this week, right? They set out from the mount of the Lord 3 days' journey with the ark of the covenant of the Lord journeying in front of them for 3 days to seek out a resting place for them. The cloud of the Lord was over them by day as they set out from the camp. Then it came about when the ark set out that Moses said, "Rise up, Lord, let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you." And when it came to rest, he said, "Return, O Lord, to the myriad thousands of Israel." Let me show you a picture of what's going on here. This is kind of what it would have looked like as they had made camp. Everybody see that, right? Tabernacle, the red thing, filled with God's presence. We talked about this last week, man. That's like God's presence in this Eden pictured place. What do you notice about this as you look around? Who's like... It's like, is there anybody that's really closer to God's presence than anyone else? I mean, the idea being conveyed is that their camp, throughout their camp setup, is that God is equally close and at the center of their entire lives. You have the tribes of the priests whose job it was to care for the temple and were to be God's representation before men and were to be men's representation before God. And so you have them sort of circled around, just right around the outside of the camp. But then everybody else is spaced out evenly around the outside of this camp. And it's like you miss that detail. You miss that detail as you're reading through the story. Dude, I love having the kids back over. It's so good, right? And here's the picture of the marching order, right? This is what it looked like as they marched. Dude, that is so stinking small. You can't even see it. Can anybody see that? What's that say, man, right there? Oh, good. Oh, yeah, I didn't mean that like condescending, like, oh, you can read. Yeah, no, I didn't mean that. Yeah, so you guys can read it. That's what I was trying to convey. So the red arrow there, that's it's like the Ark of the Covenant, right? And that was going before the people. Did you notice who's leading the pack up there, the very top? It's Judah. Right? Conventional wisdom would say it would be the eldest tribe, but it wasn't. What's God conveying through this, man? God is giving them a picture of their leadership. Judah is going to be the tribe of the kings. Judah is the tribe that our ultimate leader, Jesus, would come from. And he's leading the pack, right? Gershom, Merari go before the Kohathites. I'll finish this thought out for us, right? Why do they go? Well, because they had to pack up the tent. The Kohathites had to take care of the Ark of the Covenant and all like the holy implements. So the idea that that Merari and Gershom, they go first because they get to where they're going and they can set up the tabernacle, and then everything else can just march right in. And this is sort of the idea that's being kept. But I really did that just to show how honestly, man, we can get bogged down in some of those details, but it's actually conveying a story at the end of it. When you see it all come together, like God was doing something and he was conveying a message of truth, even in these things, right? Chapters 10 through 12, they detail the journey to the wilderness of Paran at Kadesh and show multiple cycles of this rebellion of the people on their journey. After 2 years, they'd been there camped at Mount Sinai. Every day, they're eating manna straight from heaven, right? They leave the camp. 3 days later, this story happens. Numbers 11, 4 through 6. The rabble who were among them had greedy desires, and also the sons of Israel wept again and said, "Who will give us meat to eat? We remember the fish we used to eat free in Egypt." Bing! It's supposed to be like our little thing. It lets us know, like, actually, the cycle is kicking off again, right? Rebellion, judgment, and salvation. There's the free fish that we used to eat in Egypt, the cucumbers and the melons and the leeks and the onions and the garlic. Man, I bet their breath was atrocious. But now our appetite is gone. There's nothing at all to look at except for this stinking manna. Every single day we eat this stuff, right? And this kicks off that cycle, right? And there's actually a bunch of these. It isn't just the meat. It's water. It's Moses' leadership. They get fed up with that. Dude, it's just over. And it's like several cycles of the same thing. It's like they still didn't learn their lesson. God is conditioning the Exodus generation to trust him through these trials. What did God say about the manna when he gave it to them the very first time? He told the people of Israel, this is a test. I'm going to test you every single day. I want to condition you to trust me in the most basic of functions. And here's the really sad reality of this. I see people that claim to be followers of Jesus who supposedly trusted him for their like eternal salvation, and yet won't trust him for like daily provisions. Grace, mercy, and that thing at work that's going on. And it's like all of a sudden now, it's like God's big enough to solve the problems of my soul, but he's not big enough to solve like that terrible coworker that's making life miserable for me at work. And what do I do in that? Like, where does my wisdom come from in this? Like, God's wisdom is good enough when it comes to my like eternal like resting place, but it's not good enough for like the everyday things of life. And God's like, no, man, you got it backwards. If you're ever going to really fully trust me in these deeper, like more soul level things, man, then like I want to condition you in some of these simpler things. And so every day God says, I'm going to test you. 6 days a week, I'm going to test you. Will you trust me? Don't gather too much. It's going to rot and stink in your tent. 6th day, it's different. I know it don't look no different. It don't smell no different, but it's different. Gather twice as much because tomorrow I'm not bringing any. We come to a place. There's no water there. Did I bring you out here to kill you? No. Trust me. I know you need food. I made you. I know you need water too. Like, will you trust me in this? And so over and over again, they get these chances to touch the stove, find out it's hot, and then next time they come to that place, not touch the stove again. But what do? They touch the stove every single time, right? I oftentimes see people in these moments of crisis, and it's hard to convince them Like, it's hard to convince someone that the flames of crisis, like in the middle of that God can still be and often is most effective at shaping our character in and through crisis. God didn't necessarily bring that. Y'all, we are plenty capable of bringing crisis on our own. We are plenty capable of just the nature of 7 billion people in rebellion to God. Like we're going to experience the waves of crisis. God is big enough and good enough to still work in that, to forge something valuable in you. I got this example a few weeks ago, though. Forging is a hot and violent process. Dude, it is red hot. It's beating the impurities out of something. It's strengthening something through striking it over and over again. Man, forging is this violent thing, but if we don't have that process, then we don't get the precious thing that comes out the other side of it. So Numbers 10 through 12 is about. Numbers 13 through 19 record the rebellion of Israel that caused them to wander the wilderness for 40 years and the death of an entire generation. So in this section, this is, again, it's when they rebel, and God is going to, you're walking for 40 years, and there's never a moment, if you read through the story, where they're like, and 40 years has passed and the entire generation has died out, right? Like we don't get that in the story. It's actually not super clear cut when that really happened. We get a point way later in the story that says that the entire generation had died out. Right, but given the context, we know that had happened probably chapters and chapters before. But what we get is this moment where God, like Moses, begins giving them this list of laws. Again, like a lot of them are a restatement of things that he's already told the previous generation, and he's maybe adjusted or amended some things for how they're going to live in the land. And I want you to think of this section like children's church. God is speaking to the Joshua generation, preparing them to enter the land. Chapters 20 and 21 tell about the move out of the wilderness of Paran to the borders of Canaan at the plains of Moab. And in this section, we read something really disappointing. We read the same exact failures that we read in the first travel section. This new generation came to a moment in their story where they had an opportunity to learn from their parents that just because doesn't look like there's enough food or water here, God still provides. And they have to learn their lesson. And God doesn't just throw his hands up and he's like, oh, y'all should have learned that by now. Poof, you're dead, And Joshua, Caleb, we'll start over with y'all's family. He doesn't do that. What does he do? He begins conditioning this new family, right? In this section, Moses begins a list of more instructions at the end of this about how they're to live in the land, right? Actually, I think I missed one there. The final section, 22 through 36, that's the arrival at the border of the promised land and Moses' final instructions to the people before entering. You get that? Okay, cool. And in this section, Moses begins those list of instructions that will be continued. That's what the entire next book of Deuteronomy is about next week, right? Moses is about to go up on the mountain. He's going to watch them cross over into the promised land. Moses is gone, and now it's the Joshua generation's time in the stage. But before they do that, Moses reiterates this law with some things that come in hindsight from watching an entire generation and how they interacted with God's law and how they failed at every turn with it. And he's going to give them some new instructions. He's going to adjust some of these things, and he's going to tell them how they can live faithfully in God's presence in the land. You guys good? You guys good? Can we say Numbers is hard? Is that all right? Yes, Numbers is hard. Thank you. It is very hard. And there is a very diverse list of stories. I didn't even touch the Balaam and Balak story. Sorry about that. You're going to have to go to Expedition Group tonight if you want to talk about that, right? Because they'll get a chance to talk about the talking donkey and all that good stuff later, right? And that's just it, man. It's really hard. As you sit here, and that's kind of the problem every week, is how do you tell the story of Numbers faithfully without telling the entire, we'd be here for 6 hours, right? And these chairs have about a 1 hour limit before your butt falls asleep. Everybody tracking? Yeah. And so how do you pick what you go through? And I told you guys, I want to do my best to give you sort of the overall flavor and what the book is trying to communicate week in and week out. But the thing that really hits home every week, The thing that has the ability to change our life is the picture of Christ that we see in the book of Numbers. Man, it hasn't failed. Every week, there have been multiple pictures of Jesus and of the gospel. And that's the thing. That's like the story that's happening behind the story that has the ability to change our lives. And so let's look at one awesome story from the book of Numbers. Numbers chapter 21, verse 5 through 10. People spoke out against God and Moses. Why have you brought us out of Egypt to die in this wilderness? Ping. All right, there's our cycle. It begins again. There's no food and no water. We loathe this miserable food, broken record, right? Well, I didn't tell you guys this, it was in my notes earlier, but one of the rebellions was Moses against the people. Y'all, who has the joy of leading other people in their daily job? Military folks, managers, that kind of stuff. Moses cries out and asks God to kill him at one point in the journey. Anybody relate, man? Yeah, I mean, God, take me now. I can't stand these people. And this is before the 40 years even kicked off. And God's like, oh, buddy, I got something in store for you next, right? And you don't even know what's coming. Moses wasn't even tracking that they were about to spend 40 more years in the wilderness. And so God's like, no, can't have you checking out on me, right? And so anyways, that happens early. So again, this is the Joshua generation. They're having to learn the food lesson. And so the Lord, what does he do? Does he just rain down food and quail like he did last time? No. He sends fiery serpents among the people, and they bit the people so that many of Israel died. How many of you guys snakes? It's like, nope, I'm gone. I'm out, man, right? It's a few of you guys, right? What in the world? So the people came to Moses and said, we have sinned, obviously, because we have spoken against the Lord, and you intercede with the Lord that he may remove these serpents from us. And Moses interceded for the people. Go to bat for us. Pray for us. Right? Then the Lord said to Moses, here's what I want you to do. I'm not going to take the fire serpents away. Right? I want you to do something. I want you to make a fiery serpent. I want you to set it on a standard. That's a pole. Brass serpent. I want you to set it on a pole. And it shall come about that everyone who is bitten, when he looks at it, he will live. Moses made a bronze serpent and set it on the standard. And it came about that if the serpent bit any man, when he looked at the bronze serpent, he lived. Now the sons of Israel moved out and camped at Oboth. That's how the story ends. It's awesome, dude. Love that. So it's one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament, right? So we just read about these cycles. Rebellion, judgment. Y'all picked that up when you saw that. Rebellion, judgment, and salvation. All of it happened again, right? They were tired of food. They were tired of water. So God sends these venomous snakes in the camp to kill a lot of people. God is reaching back to Genesis 3 imagery in this moment, right? Details. Remember details? Don't get bogged down. Like this in this instance, it isn't something as much as looking forward as looking backwards at what's happening in the overarching story. Moses wrote Genesis and Exodus, Leviticus and Numbers, and he's conveying something through the story, something that God knew he was going to get, and the people he's reaching back. Genesis chapter 3. And that is to say, you've bought the lie that the serpent, you've bought the lie of the serpent that you can rebel against God's provision and define good and evil for yourself. It's the lie of the serpent that led to the death of every human since Adam and Eve. God has concentrated this truth in a deadly and painful object lesson for the people. Here's the deal, man. God could have made Moses put anything on that pole. Honestly, if it were me, I think I would have put a lamb or something on it, right? I mean, that's a good picture of Jesus, right? That's awesome. That would have been really cool to read about. But he didn't. He had him put a serpent, and I think that was incredibly intentional. I think the imagery is perfect, and here's why. In that moment, the serpent on the pole was a visible symbol of the consequences of their sin and rebellion. Their recognition of the consequences of their sin and rebellion, right? And God's ability to deliver them from it is what saved them. And here's how that relates to Jesus. John chapter 3, if you have your Bibles, turn it there, man. We'll look at something and we're closing her down. Jesus having a conversation with this man named Nicodemus. Nicodemus was a religious leader, and Jesus was trying to convey the truth of who he was to Nicodemus. And Nicodemus wasn't getting it. So Jesus readjusts his tactics, and here's what he says to him. John chapter 3, verses 9. pick up there. Nicodemus said, how can these things be? I don't get it. I don't get what you're saying. I don't understand who you are and who you think you are and what you're claiming is going to happen here. And so Jesus answered and said to him, are you the teacher of Israel and you don't understand these things? Dude, Jesus is quick-witted, man. And it's just truly, truly, I say to you, we speak of what we know and testify of what we have seen, and you do not accept our testimony. If I told you earthly things and you do not believe them, how will you believe if I tell you these deeper spiritual realities, heavenly things? No one has ascended into heaven but he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man. So then listen to what Jesus says. Really weird story. He uses a story that Nicodemus knew. He says, as Moses lifted up the serpent in the wilderness, even so must the Son of Man be lifted up, so that whoever believes will in him have eternal life. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whoever believes in him shall not perish but have eternal life. For God did not send the Son into the world to judge the world, but that the world might be saved through him. You see some of the language of this cycle, like this rebellion, judgment. So you guys tracking some of the language that Jesus was pulling back on here in the book of John. Seeing that? Right? He who believes in him is not judged. He who does not believe has been judged already. Because the consequences of their own choices to define good and evil is a judgment in and of itself. Because he's not believed in the name of the only begotten Son. And here's what Jesus is saying. Let me read this very slowly. Jesus is saying that there is coming a moment in my ministry when I will be lifted up on a pole just like that fiery serpent. In that moment, I will be representing the accumulated collection of mankind's rebellion against God. In that moment, I will also be representing the judgment due mankind because of their rebellion. It is to that moment that you must look and see the consequences of your rebellion and sin, because in that moment, I will be absorbing the judgment that you could never pay for as I offer salvation to all who will believe in me. Jesus is pictured in the fiery serpent on a pole as the one who took our rebellion, endured the judgment on our behalf, and offered salvation to anyone who would look to him and believe. Here's the deal. We aren't Israelites, are we? We're not thirsting for water. Although I am right now, right? We're not ready to stone our leadership and go back to Egypt again. I hope you're not. At least not physically. No, our thirsts are much more subtle and sophisticated. I want to define what is good for my own morals, my own marriage, relationships, generosity, love for others, work, rest, 1,000 other things. It isn't just these individual areas, man. I want to do this on the whole scale of my life because I know me better than anybody knows me. I can choose and define what's good for me better than anybody can choose that. I can run my life better than anyone else can do that. And here's the deal, man. This is the terrifying reality is that God will absolutely honor your decision to do that. Just know that the book of Numbers is saying that you won't find what you think you're going to find at the end of that journey. Only as we trust God in our whole life as Lord and in every single area of life will we really find true life. Perhaps you're in this moment right now where there doesn't seem to be any water, right? Just the metaphorical, maybe you're in one of these wilderness seasons. Maybe you're in the middle of something that looks like a trial. The future is uncertain. The good news from the book of Numbers is that these are the things that God often uses to shape us into a people who can trust in Him and find life. He didn't necessarily bring that hard thing, but the good news of today's lesson is that He can definitely use it in the accumulation of your road trip of life to point your eyes towards Him and ultimately towards life. You guys good with that? This book of Numbers, what do y'all think, man? Yeah, pretty good stuff. I like it, and I think our kids are about to tear the windows out of the front up there. So I would love to have a conversation with you because this isn't like something you can really do one-sided. This is something like, this is a journey. There isn't just one point of contact with this truth that like Oh, now I get it. All right, what do we read? Numbers over and over and over and over again. And some of us just admitted from the very front, Jake, that we like to touch the stove over and over again, right? We have to figure out, like here's the good news, man, is that, like, man, there is a group of people here at this church. This is what this is, man. It's like we are along for the journey with you. I'd love to begin that conversation of what does it look like to choose Jesus the very first time, or what does it look like to follow after him in maybe this difficult wilderness, thirsty season that you may be in, right? So wherever you're at, we'd love to have a conversation. Point you to the hope that is in Christ and walk with you in the journey, right? Let's pray. Lord, we love you and we praise you. Thank you for the stories that you've given us in this amazing book. Thank you for an entire generation of accumulated experiences that you invite us to learn from and to walk in faithfulness. Father, I pray that you would press this truth into my heart this week in the thousands of areas that I desperately need it. Keep us safe, keep our families safe as we serve you and one another this week. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Have a great week, guys.